currently we already have some rights on the law books, but they are not being enforced. Now the same body that failed to enforce our rights is going to be put in charge of creating more rights on the paper. I don't trust that body to have good rules in place because that body is colluding with the airlines. And even if the rules were good, I don't trust that body to enforce our rights because of its track record of not enforcing our rights until now.
Thanks for doing an interview with me. So yesterday, the Minister of Transport Canada finally came up with the Transportation Modernization Act, I think, and in it has the air passenger rights bill. So what do you feel about what do you think about the bill so far? So far, from what I've seen in the news reports, there are a lot of positive vibe about this bill, and passengers seems to like it. News report headlines or editorials have positive things to say about it. What's your feel about the bill?
The bill is a lump of coal in a bag of sugar. It is an attempt to deceive the public to believe that travelers are getting some rights, while in reality it is a mere shell.
Why do you say that? Like, I guess you have your critique of the air transport agency. Is that part of the issue where the problem you have? Can you elaborate?
The first issue is that the bill contains no specifics. It merely says that the Canadian Transportation Agency shall make regulations about certain issues. Many of those issues are already governed by the law. The reason that we don't see them as passengers is because of lack of enforcement, not because of lack of laws. So the way I would describe the current state of affairs is that of dictatorship and its constitution. Dictatorships tend to have constitutions, but nobody follows them. The same thing is happening with airlines. We already have many rights set out in the law books, but those rights are not being enforced. They're not being enforced because the Canadian Transportation Agency is in bed with the industry.
Part of, I think, or at least what the minister is saying, they're going to make all our rights clearer, I guess, simple words describing what our rights are. Wouldn't it be the case where once us or the passenger knows our rights, then the airline would do the right thing, just like in the States where, like, after the poor doctor got dragged off the plane and then result in probably a multi-million-dollar settlement. We don't know how much United settled the lawsuit for. Wouldn't it be the case that in Canada, hey, once we know what our rights are, then all those problems would go away?
Knowing the right is not enough. You can know your rights, yet it doesn't mean that you are going to get what you are entitled to. The question that this bill fails to answer, and fails to address even, never mind answer, is what happens when you have a right, you tell the airline, I am owed compensation, and the airline tells you, piss off. What is going to happen then? Minister Garneau says he doesn't want to impose stiff penalties on airlines for breaking the rules. That is the key statement here. Everything else is secondary. We can bicker here about this right or that right, that amount of compensation or another. But as long as the rules are not binding on the airlines in practice, as long as they only have the shape of something binding, but in practice, airlines can get away with not complying with the rules. The rules are not worth the paper they are written on.
So if I hear you right, what your worry is, even if the Canadian Transport Agency come up with some really great things to help passenger and whatnot, but if they are not being enforced, if there's no stick carry with, hey, if you don't comply with what is in the law, I mean, after all, I think you fought a few legal cases in Canada, and if those are not followed, like what you're saying, passenger have those kind of rights that they currently have, and then they tell the airline customer service and whoever the person talk back, hey, I mean, so what? Or like we don't do that. Is that the issue here?
What happens in practice is when a passenger tells an airline agent, well, you have to do it because that's what the law is, they say, well, we have been told by our bosses that we don't do that. So sorry, I have to follow what my employer told me. And if you don't like it, you can take it up with my employer, the airline, with their legal department. So passengers are not forward. There's no consequence for an airline to actually break the law. It's like drinking and driving. You can have the as many laws on the book as you want, but if there are no consequences for drinking and driving, people will do it. Same thing with airlines. Airlines actually have a benefit from disobeying the law. They financially profit from disobeying the law. So in a situation when they are financially profiting from something of that nature, there has to be a financial disincentive if you want to stop it.
I remember reading there are sticks or punishment or fines already in our current law, but they're never really being used, or very nominal amount was being fined. And in terms of enforcement, the CTA taking up on customers' complaints, flyers, passengers' complaints, the enforcement has been dropping. Is that right? Can you elaborate on that?
That's correct. The rate of complaints has remained steady in the past 3 years where they have been reported, but the enforcement actions have dropped fourfold from 230 to 64. We even made a graphic the diagram of that.
And that's from the agency's own statistics. Is that right?
That's from the Canadian Transportation Agency's own statistics, yes.
Right, right. So, like, I guess your concern, if I hear you right, is the rules there, the monetary fines are there, but they're not really being used. And who is going to guarantee 1 or 2 years down the road when the new regulations or new legislation come into effect, would that change anything?
So what I'm saying is that currently we already have some rights on the law books, but they are not being enforced. Now the same body that failed to enforce our rights is going to be put in charge of creating more rights on the paper. I don't trust that body to have good rules in place because that body is colluding with the airlines. And even if the rules were good, I don't trust that body to enforce our rights because of its track record of not enforcing our rights until now.
Right, collusion is a strong word. I'll let you maybe elaborate on it. But let me ask you, in the case of...
I'm happy to elaborate on that. What I mean by that is, first, there is an institutional bias. Just last year, the Canadian Transportation Agency stated in an interview to the press that Canadian airlines are among the best in the world, in its opinion. This was a grossly inappropriate comment from a body that is supposed to adjudicate disputes between passengers and airlines. We have the enforcement statistics that we discussed, and we have the personnel issue. The vice chairman of the Canadian Transportation Agency is a former lobbyist for the airlines. The manager of the enforcement is on first-name basis with the industry, according to her own admission. And the chief complaint officer is a lawyer who was suspended by the Law Society of Upper Canada for misconduct, and he was never reinstated.
Those are very serious stuff. So,
and to be clear, I have tracked down his disciplinary record, and I posted a copy of it online. It's public.
Right. I've seen it. So I won't elaborate on that since you have already elaborated on it. So take the United case, which the minister himself referenced a few times. As a result of the United case, looks like all the airlines are, not all, but few of the major U.S. airlines are bumping up their voluntary compensation to up to, I think, $10,000 US. So to me, when I look at that amount, it's like, well, if you up the amount from a few $100s to not only $1,000 something to $10,000, maybe there'll be more passengers who are willing to, like in case of overbooking and whatnot, willing to give up their seat so that there won't be issue of there won't be issue of people who really cannot take a different plane. Basically, it's sort of the issue a little bit. Can you say something about like what is, like, based on what we have seen, there's no mention of amount, and in the new proposed legislation or regulations. Do you care to comment like that
Yes.
$10,000 amount in
So
case of Canada?
not having amounts in the legislation is the only thing for which I don't fault the legislation. Because amounts are things that you want to adjust on an annual basis or semi-annual annual basis or biannual basis, and it is not unusual to have the exact amounts hashed out in the regulation. Everything else, though, the conditions for the compensation, in what cases passengers would get compensation, what are the exceptions, the definitions of what would and wouldn't entitle passengers for compensation, all those would need to be hashed out in the legislation and not in regulation. So I see no trace here of anything that would actually prevent airlines from bumping passengers involuntarily and would force airlines to keep offering higher and higher amounts until there are enough volunteers. There's simply no trace of that anywhere in the law, even though the minister has been claiming that that is in the legislation.
So the minister is claiming there's way to stop airline from bumping passenger at all, or is it just or once they are on an airplane? Like the case is different, right? Before they get onto an airplane, bumping versus the case of the United Doctor. He was on the plane and then he got kicked off.
What has been reported in the news is that the legislation would actually prevent people from being involuntarily denied boarding against their will, or being basically denied boarding against their will, period. So what it suggests that the legislation would provide for a regime where airlines have to seek volunteers all the time. That's also what Minister Garneau has been representing to the public. But there are no such provisions in the actual legislation that was tabled. So Minister Garneau is either unfamiliar with his own bill or is being dishonest. It is up to the public to decide which of the two. I cannot decide that.
Right. So final question. Based on all the public report of the news, like I said before, it seems to be quite positive, positively received. So what are some major myths that you have seen in the news reporting in Canada about this piece of, or around the world, about this piece of legislation that you want to make clear and clarify?
News reports have simply copy-pasted what the government has been giving out as an information, which is false, instead of actually looking at the body of the legislation and looking at its content.
Can you give some specific examples, like with or without naming the news agency? Can you give some examples, like you've seen?
The legislation contains no specifics whatsoever. There is not a single right that this would confer on the public. It simply creates a shell that needs to be filled out with content at a later time. This has been missed by the press. The press has been touting this bill as giving passengers clarity in their rights, as creating a compensation regime, which it has not done. Those things are not in the legislation.
So those are deferred to the agency, right? To be decided by the agency.
That's in the future time. But as of today, as of this time, nothing has changed. Even when this bill becomes a law, nothing is going to change for passengers who travel the next day until there are some regulations in place in the future, which is yet to be seen. Another problem is the lack of enforcement, which has been quite missed by most of the press.
Like you're talking about.
The agency is being put in charge of this, even though they have a track record of failing to enforce our rights in the past.
Yeah. So your worry is, sure, we can. Even the regulations developed by the agency can be very, very strong on the surface, but if the same agency is not going to enforce it, or if there's no manpower or no will to enforce it, then the Canadian traveling public is not going to be protected.
Exactly. So a law is worth the paper that it is written on, unless there is a strong enforcement mechanism to back it. The bill does not change the current enforcement mechanism, which has shown to be a failure, which has been shown to be a failure. The Canadian Transportation Agency has not been enforcing our rights until now. There's nothing changing in the regulations or in the legislative structure that would change the problems, the core problems, which are lack of enforcement.
Right. So one final question is, I've read somewhere, you still advising people, hey, don't trust too much of this legislation or future regulations coming. Take their cases to small claim courts. But isn't there's an issue where there's a big airlines there, big small airlines, all of them have legal departments, and us traveling publics don't have the money or time.
Taking case to small claims court is relatively cheap and very simple compared to the more complex legal proceedings. But if every passenger who had an issue took their cases to small claims courts, or even if every 10th passenger took their case to small claims courts, airlines would not be able to do this because their legal bills would be so large that they would have to actually begin to follow the law.
All right, well, thank you very much, Gabby, for talking with me today, and I'll keep on following this news and check with you when CTA come up with the regulations, and once that happens, and see how will they enforce it. I guess will anything change in the coming months and years. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you very much for having me.